the this class there's four classes. Um, the purpose of the class is to try to put our current age of conflict in some historical context, and a historical context in two ways. One is to
It
provide a
started, David. It
methodology
started.
for trying to understand
Can you see it?
why ages of conflict like we have now occur. And the other historical context is to try to look back, at least very briefly, on ages of conflict that have occurred in the past in Western civilization, and to try to understand why these things happen, how they tend to play out, and how they've been overcome successfully in Western civilization, unlike most civilizations. But the genesis of the class was really the question of that my wife kept asking me, why is this happening? And there's a lot of explanations that are offered for why we're having the current age of conflict. One is that social media and cable news has put us all into silos where we hear nothing but our own ideas and our own biases, and we get polarized and radicalized by listening to nothing but one point of view. In fact, I'll mention it at that point that there used to be a podcast called, I think it was called Uncertainty, but they started with the proposition that people feel most strongly about those things they know the least about. And that is a proposition that sounds sort of counterintuitive until you realize that the more you know about any issue, the more you realize that there's no issue that's simple, and that there are a lot of different points of view that should come into play in addressing an issue. And it becomes harder and harder to begin to think that you have some sort of monopoly on the truth when you realize how complex issues are. In fact, I'm reading a book right now called Resolved.
Get closer to the speaker.
That proposes that we institute a debate structure in our schools, because debaters, by virtue of formal debate, which is not like the debates we see on television, debaters have to understand both sides of issues, and they come to realize the complexity and the nuance. There's been a lot of explanations given. One is, like I mentioned, the social media silos that we're in, the cable news silos that we're in. The other explanation is Trump. The easy explanation is this is all Trump's fault. But I think Barack Obama was correct when he said that Donald Trump is as much an effect as he is a cause. And the question is, the effect of what? What has caused Donald Trump? There's something, I think, more fundamental at an economic and social level that we need to explore before we can really understand why Donald Trump is happening and why there are people who support Donald Trump. And I don't mean to suggest that everybody that supports Donald Trump is necessary. Well, I don't mean to say anything about that. I just mean to say that there are deeper causes than just to say Donald Trump is the cause of our problems. The other thing is that the crisis that we're in isn't limited to the United States. It's a crisis that has affected almost every Western nation. In France, they're the yellow vests. In Britain, there's Brexit. In Eastern Europe, in the EU, there are autocratic moves by leaders in Poland and other Eastern European countries that entered the EU. There in Germany, there's a revival of right-wing and Nazi groups, including infiltration of their police and the military. So the problem that we're experiencing isn't just a problem in the United States. And for that reason, it probably can't be explained by by things that are necessarily limited to the United States. So what is an explanation? The explanation that I want to explain today is based on a professor that I had at Georgetown that Bill Clinton also had, and I've told this story many times, that Bill Clinton and I both went to Foreign Service School. He was a senior when I was a freshman, and every student at the Foreign Service School had to take a course taught by a man by the name of Carroll Quigley. It was called Evolution of Civilizations. And when Bill Clinton gave his acceptance speech in the Democratic Convention in 1992, he mentioned that the two people that were most influential in his life were John Kennedy and Carroll Quigley. And of course, everybody knew who John Kennedy was, and almost everybody but Foreign Service School graduates said, Carroll who? Quigley had a theory that civilizations go through various stages. And we all know that civilizations have a beginning, they grow and prosper, they reach a peak of power and prosperity, and then most civilizations decay and decline. Western civilization has been unique in having gone through an age of conflict at least 3 times before and reformed itself and re-entered an age of expansion. But the stages that Quigley gave for civilizations are mixture. His proposition was that every civilization usually starts with the combination of 2 previously existing societies or civilization. A gestation period when the instruments, what he calls instruments, are developed that allow the civilization to grow and to prosper. An age of expansion, then an age of conflict. Depending on how the age of conflict is resolved, the subsequent step is usually what's called what he called a universal empire, but basically an authoritarian empire. Then decay, and then destruction of the civilization. So, what causes an age of conflict? Well, let's talk about what Quigley's proposition was, that the institutions or the instruments that we create to meet societal needs begin not to work as well. And the one that he identified as perhaps the most important was that a society, in order to grow, needs to create incentives to invent new means of addressing needs and wants. That somewhere in the society, there needs to be an accumulation of a surplus, and that surplus needs to be utilized to pay for or to finance new investments. And every society, every civilization has developed what he called an instrument of expansion. And those 3 steps are all steps that can break down in the instrument of expansion. The society may not provide incentives to invent new means. Islamic civilization largely failed because Islamic civilization discouraged new inventions, believing that the status quo was divinely ordained by God and couldn't be changed. Slave societies have also been uniquely, have created or lacked incentives to create new instruments, because the person's most likely to know what needed to change and how to change it were the slaves themselves, and they had no incentive to make those changes. There needs to be an accumulation of a surplus. It doesn't need to be accumulated in the hands of necessarily economic actors. Some civilizations have accumulated the surplus in religious structures, others in military or political, and others in economic. And then the most difficult is the surplus needs to be utilized to pay for or create new inventions. What can oftentimes go wrong, and I think to a certain extent we may be at risk of this, to a certain extent the the surplus gets invested either in luxury items that don't produce any necessary good or new inventions, but also the one that I think is we're at risk of is that a lot of the surplus gets invested in financial markets, where the surplus is used basically to finance speculation as opposed to funding new investments. But there are other instruments that Quigley identified that societies need to create. One is a military. The purpose is to address the need for group security from internal and external threats. Another is political, the need to organize interpersonal power and authority relationships to minimize conflict. Another is economic, which we just discussed. Another is social, to meet the need for companionship. Another is religious. This is one that surprised me, I remember, when I first read his book, because he put religion in the category of the need for psychological certainty, purpose, and value. And until recently, I don't think I ever quite appreciated the importance of religions for psychological certainty, the psychological component of religions. And then the last instrument is an intellectual, the ability to understand and explain reality. All of these things operate together. All of these things are constantly undergoing changes at their own level, changes that affect the other. For example, the technology to create an atomic bomb had profound implications for military, because we were no longer, frankly, capable of necessarily protecting ourselves from an external threat other than by threatening annihilation to anybody who would use those kinds of weapons. And that military development had implications for politics, because our politics, both at a national level and at an international level, had not been structured around or addressed the problem of being able to destroy ourselves. Political dynamics and structures that were sufficient to address the types of military problems that existed before atomic weapons were no longer sufficient to address the possibility that you could have a war that would destroy the entire Earth. Social. I think in our society right now, there's increasing evidence of a crisis in our social structures, a degeneration of communities, religious, and I guess also on the social plane. I was reading an article recently about the epidemic of teenage suicides, and it's hard for me to imagine a more telling measure of the health of a society than when its young people are increasingly inclined to want to take their own lives. And then intellectual, the need to understand and explain reality. And to a certain extent, I think science has taken us to an area where most of us lack the intellectual capability of understanding reality. So we have issues, I think, on all those levels, and we'll get into some of those in later classes in more depth. So what happened? Why do the instruments that we create, that a society creates, why do they start becoming less functional? And it's that process that creates the age of conflict. The instruments start working less well, and because they are working less well, it creates conflict. So why do they start working less well? Well, Quigley said there are a couple of reasons that are repeated through history, but the two most basic are, one, that the people that man the institutions become self-interested, that they begin to operate the institution not consistent or always primarily consistent with the social purposes for which it was created, but for their selfish interest. And that becomes most telling when the instrument needs to change. Well, why would the instrument need to change? The instrument needs to change because our physical conditions change and our social conditions change. The conditions that existed when the instrument was created and which allowed them to operate effectively change. And unless the instrument can adapt to that change, it will become less and less functional. For example, in terms of physical conditions right now, one of the most obvious is climate change. Our economic prosperity for the post-war period has been fueled, literally, by fossil fuels. Now we are in a situation where the use of those fossil fuels is increasingly a threat to our own physical survival. Are we going to can we make the change? Well, I think there's obviously things that are occurring that might encourage the belief that we can make the change, although the greatest risk is that we can't do it soon enough or quickly enough. But there's also, at least, especially there have been groups that are fighting to prevent that change from occurring, that are attempting to preserve the market share of fossil fuels in providing our energy. And the market share that fossil fuels have of our meeting our energy needs has been subsidized by the government in many ways. So those industries are reluctant to see their subsidies eliminated, and they're reluctant to see their market position deteriorate. Another way that things change is that there are changes in technology that affect how instruments operate. For example, in our post-war era has primarily been built, at least in the United States and in Western Europe, on the employment of people in jobs. The prosperity of the middle class and the working class has been the fundamental driver of our economy for 40 years. Well, now there are two changes that are occurring that's affecting that, more than two, but two prominent ones.
What that is?
One is
Yeah.
the digital economy and artificial intelligence, where an increasing number of jobs formerly done by humans are now done with technology. I remember there's a stunning number of the number of men or persons that it used to take to build a car on an assembly line. It's probably 1/4 or 1/10 now of what it used to be because of the technology that's used on the assembly line now. Another change that has occurred is that change of employment that is globalization, a change in social structures. We now have a global economy, and that has produced two things. On a global level, it's improved the prosperity of billions of people. The world on a whole is a much better place today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But in the United States and in Western Europe, cheaper labor in developing countries has become a real problem for workers in the United States who can't compete at the wage levels that workers in other countries can. There are things that are happening that are beginning to change that, but those are examples of how an economic instrument can become less functional because both the physical situation in which it operates and the social structures in which it operates are changing. Now, these are the sort of characteristics that Quigley described of an age of expansion which we are moving out of and into an age of conflict. In an age of expansion, there's increased production of goods, increased population, geographic expansion, increased knowledge and understanding. Those expansions occur at different rates in the core area of the civilization versus the periphery. In an age of conflict, there's a declining rate of expansion. Anybody who's aware of the growth in our GDP knows for at least 15 years that people have been complaining that our rate of growth has slowed. Increased group or class conflict. And in that regard, we certainly have increased group and class conflict, including racial conflict or ethnic conflict. As the society becomes increasingly dysfunctional, the groups that are suffering the most tend to blame somebody for that happening, and they often find an ethnic group or a racial group or class or all three to blame for their situation. So there's an increase in group or class conflict. There tends to be an increase in war, particularly imperial wars. I mean, I don't know whether our war in Iraq and our war in Afghanistan necessarily count as imperial wars. Afghanistan, not initially, but once we decided to try to remake Afghanistan into a democracy, you could say it had all the underwritings of an imperial war, of an effort to recreate a society. The Iran war, to me, was almost an imperial war. It just looked like we were looking for an excuse to go in to Iran. Another characteristic of age and conflict is increasing rationality, pessimism, superstition, what Quigley described as otherworldliness, but basically a loss of trust in rational thinking. And just increasing irrationality, and that reminds me that I once read an article about one of the keys that the Soviets used to try to foment revolution in other countries.
It's 7:30.
Was to cause a society to become in a state where no one trusted anything in terms of finding the truth. It's not a matter, and to use Donald Trump as an example, under the Soviet strategies, you didn't need to convince the society that you had the truth. All you needed to do was convince the society that no one had any part of the truth. There was no point in listening to anyone. It's all fake news. And once it's all fake news, then the authoritarians have a freer reign. And that was a Soviet methodology, a methodology that perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, is being used in our own country now. There's also an increase in gambling, narcotics, intoxicants, a decline in mental health, increased crime, and what Quigley, I guess, being a Puritan, described as an obsession with sex. If the age of conflict reforms itself, it goes back into an age of expansion. If it doesn't reform itself, it goes into an age of universal empire. But the essence of the universal empire is an authoritarian response. Why an authoritarian response in an age of conflict? Because of the conflict, there is an increasing need and desire to use force to suppress the conflict, a la yesterday. There's also an increasing desire to use force to get your way, a la yesterday. So the authoritarian impulse doesn't necessarily come from the right. It can. It did in Germany come from the right, although I'll come back to that in a minute. But in Russia, the age of conflict resulted in an authoritarian response from the left. So the truth of the matter is that all political actors in an age of conflict are tempted to use force more and more because they are frustrated both by the conflict in order to suppress the conflict, but also because the society, because the instruments of the society are becoming less effective, there is more of a need to coerce people into doing what the leaders of those instruments believe needs to be done for them to function properly. And so there are two sources for that authoritarian impulse: use of force to effect change, use of force to suppress conflict, and use of coercion to try to force these instruments that are increasingly dysfunctional to try to make them work better. So in the age of conflict, what happens? Well, the first thing to recognize, and this reminds me of the line from Dickens, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. The age of conflict follows an age of expansion. So an age of conflict does not occur when things are desperate or terrible. Actually, an age of expansion occurs when things are good, but they're getting less good, and our expectations of improvements are being disappointed. So, in fact, Quigley had a paragraph in his book that I was going to reproduce here. This was written in 1957. He said that what happens in an age of expansion is that people have an expectation coming in the age of expansion that their lives are going to get better, and even more importantly, that their children's lives are going to get better. That when the expansion starts to slow down, they begin to believe that their children's lives may not be better than theirs, and that creates conflict. There was a book by Crane Brinton called The Anatomy of a Revolution. He studied the revolutions, the Russian Revolution, the French, the American, and the English revolutions. And his proposition was, and he supposedly demonstrated it in the book, that revolutions don't occur when people are desperate. They occur when expectations exceed results. And so it's very possible to look out at our society and say, my God, great things are happening in our society. And they are. In some sense, we are in the best of times. But because those things are starting to work less well than they used to, conflict is developing. And unless we address the underlying causes of that conflict, it will only worsen, and ultimately we'll get an authoritarian response, according to Quigley's methodology. In an age of conflict, there's an anti-elitism that develops because there's a resentment of the elite. And we'll go into that in the third class about how probably almost all of us on this Zoom are members of a meritocracy, a new form of elitism that is becoming just as class restricting as any prior period. But there's an anti-elitism. There are conflicts between those people who manage and are successfully managing instruments that need to be changed, who want to preserve the status quo because they're profiting from the status quo, and a popular discontent with the status quo that believes everything's rigged. there's conflicts between those who believe the problem is change and those who believe the problem is lack of change. What do I mean by that? There's two basic responses that occur in an age of conflict when things start to work less well. Some people look at the situation and say, you know, the reason things are getting worse is because we've gotten away from the fundamentals that we used to adhere to more in a more disciplined manner. The problem that we have is that things are changing too much. We need to go back to the ways we did these things in the past and restore and restore the prosperity of the past. MAGA, Trump's whole movement is built on that concept. On the other hand, there are people who look at the situation and say, we need to reform and change these instruments. And the problem we have is not with change, it's with the fact that we're not changing enough or fast enough. And then the authoritarian impulse is another attribute of the age of conflict. So what happens in the age of conflict? What is the determinative factor of whether we go back into an age of expansion or go into a universal empire or an authoritarian structure? If we can reform one possibility is that we reform the instrument. In other words, the social structures that we created, economic, political, they are reformed, they change in order to adapt to new circumstances, and we begin on a new age of expansion. Another possibility is that the old instrument is simply allowed to wither away and some new instrument is created. We don't reform the old one, we just let it wither away and we create a new one. The third possibility is what Quigley referred to as the triumph of vested interest without reform. And that's the triumph that must, in a sense, use authoritarian methods. When I say authoritarian methods, that is not to say that universal empire is unpopular and simply imposed upon people. I'm reading right now a fascinating book called Hitler's Beneficiaries. I've read a number of books about the Third Reich to try to understand that, because I think a lot of Quigley's methodology came out of his attempt to understand what happened in Germany. But what's really impressive in this book, Hitler's Beneficiaries, is how much Hitler did for basically the working class in Germany. This surprised me. He increased taxes on corporations in order to reduce taxes on the working class. He created all sorts of social programs that benefited the working class. As the book mentions, if you were an Aryan German, Hitler did a lot of things that enhanced your life and made it a lot better. Increasingly, he had to do that by confiscating wealth from disadvantaged groups, and particularly the Jews, in order to finance his own war without forcing the German population to pay the cost of the war that he'd gotten them into. But the authoritarian response often comes about as part of a democratic process. Now, Hitler never had a majority in Germany. At most, he had at one point, I think, 34% of the Reichstag, and that was his highest, the highest percentage that the Nazi Party ever had. But he was popular enough with that 34%, and his opponents politically were wildly divided. The center and the left was was divided into a multitude of parties and conflicting groups, and could never organize themselves to be unified enough to oppose the Nazis. And then, of course, once Hitler had been in power long enough to get control of the means of coercion that the state typically has a monopoly on, he started to use that against his enemies to suppress democracy completely. That is where we are right now. That fundamental effort to define what's wrong with these instruments, how do we change them, what do we do to fix these problems which are not profound. Again, it's the disparity between expectations and performance. Quigley claimed that Western civilization had gone through several stages of development and ages of expansion and then conflict. The first stage of conflict was actually before the Renaissance. The second age of conflict was, according to his methodology, and these are all sort of arbitrary dates, but generally the period from 1650 to 1850 was the American Revolution, the French Revolution. And in Western civilization at that time, Napoleon was the agent of the Universal Empire. Napoleon was in the process of imposing a universal empire on Europe, and he was prevented from doing that by the United Kingdom at Waterloo in 1815. Otherwise, the core area of Western civilization would have become dominated by a Napoleonic Empire. But instead, the Napoleonic Empire was defeated, and we embarked on another age of expansion, which was, of course, the Industrial Revolution, the Agrarian Revolution, a tremendous period of growth, also a period of class oppression and other sorts of problems. By the end of the 1800s, that age of expansion was beginning to evidence various problems. Various changes had occurred. I'll go into some of those. But that age of expansion ended in an age of conflict where Nazi Germany was the potential universal empire. England was no longer capable of defeating the universal empire on the continent of Europe. Hitler would have succeeded in establishing that universal empire were it not for the United States and, even more importantly, for the Soviet Union. Hitler's obvious mistake in hindsight was invading the Soviet Union. But as a result of the defeat of Nazi Germany and the defeat of that potential universal empire, the United States and Western Europe embarked on a new age of expansion. An age of expansion that I think probably ran up until the 1990s to 2000s, when I think we began to evidence more of the problems with certain of our instruments. And we entered into our current age of conflict. As an example, a counterexample, Russian civilization entered into an age of expansion from 1500 to 1900. It entered into an age of conflict at about the end of the 1800s, just about the same time Western civilization did, until 1917. And then, by my count, not necessarily by Quigley's, I think in hindsight, we now can say that the Russian civilization entered into a universal empire that was the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And now we are seeing something else that Quigley and no other civilization ever had to deal with, is what happens when you have a civilization that collapses and that is decaying in many ways, except it still has nuclear weapons and it has access to cyber warfare, a form of warfare that could disable your opponents, even if your own society is decaying. I think that's where we are with Russia right now. Comparisons between today and what I think is the period of greatest comparison, the 1800s into the early 1900s. In the 1800s, we had an industrial and agrarian revolutions. We had tremendous advances in science, tremendous advances in culture and literature and art. World trade before the First World War was at the highest level it had ever been as a percentage of economic activity. We never got back to that level of world trade until sometime in the 1990s or even the 2000s, I think. And at that time, before World War I, the conventional wisdom was that there would never be another war that would be fought because the nations of Europe were so integrated economically, trade was so at such a high level that they would never be foolish enough to fight a war with each other. And yet we know that World War I, which was really part one of a world war that had two parts, World War I and World War II. And you can't understand World War II without understanding World War I. In any event, that age of expansion rapidly began to become a virulent age of conflict in Western civilization in the 1900s, leading to World War I. In the 1900s, there was a shift in our economic structure from primarily an agrarian and craft economy to an industrial economy. And it had the same effect on workers and what I guess might count as the middle class in those days, of putting farms out of business and putting farmers out of business, in forcing people off the farms to go to the cities to find jobs in growing industries. Today, we have a transition from an industrial economy to a digital and robotic economy. It's causing the same sorts of disruptions to our employment patterns and our social structures as the shift from an agrarian and craft economy to an industrial economy had in the 1800s and early 1900s. In the 1800s and early 1900s, there was one power that was the dominant power, the United Kingdom, that promoted free trade around the world. And that power, the UK, was facing rising economic powers that were built principally behind trade barriers, Germany and the US. But the most important thing was that the UK was facing a rising power on the continent of Europe, Germany, that would become a rival to it, even though the German Kaiser was related to Queen Victoria. Today, we have a rising power, principally, I guess, right now in China. And there have been a number of books written on what happens in world history when a rising power confronts a dominant empire, so to speak, like we are. And in most of those situations, that conflict between the rising power and the dominant power ends in war. Sometimes it doesn't, but usually it does. So among our other problems that we're facing in terms of increasing dysfunction is dealing with China. In the late 1800s and into the 1920s, we had economic inequality that we are only now beginning to match. In the UK, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a greater and greater share of economic activity was involved in finance and not the actual production of goods and services, and in some cases in unproductive financial activities. Our economy now has a greater share of our economy is now in finance than ever before, and you can raise questions as to whether all of the financial activity that we're engaging that the markets engage in involves productive investment activity. We have environmental challenges now that we had in the late 1800s and the early 1900s and into the 1900s in terms of pollution. Now we've got, in addition, climate change. And in that era, you had populist challenges and fascist challenges. And finally, in terms of the other parallels between that period and now, in the United States in particular, we had the dominance of money in politics in the late 1800s and early 1900s. We had it then and we have it now. It caused dysfunction in our political process then, especially in terms of people's willingness to recognize the political process as being legitimate. We had then a rural versus urban conflict, just as we do now. I think that it's widely recognized that the biggest political conflicts that exist in the United States today are driven by rural versus urban conflicts. And we had a misallocation of political power then, as we do now, where the rural areas had much greater political power than their numbers would justify. And in those days, we had it not only at the national level, which is a function in part of our state system, where of the Senate, each state has 2 representatives, no matter how few people live in the state, and that gives the disproportionate power to rural states that have, in fact, I forget what the exact percentages are now, but the percentage of the majority of the Senate is elected by areas that represent much less than a majority of our population. And if current trends continue where population tends to aggregate around urban areas, that misallocation will get worse over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So that if those trends continue by 2050, something like 30% of the nation will be electing a majority of the United States Senate. We had populist movements then, just as we do now. We had anti-immigrant biases then, just as we do now. We had oppression of blacks, Jim Crow era. Race relations in the United States actually got dramatically worse from the 1870s till the 1930s or 40s, maybe even to the 1950s. And we had a polarization and an inability to communicate with one another. What happened then is we reformed ourselves. And we helped to reform all of Western civilization at the same time. What happens now is the open question. And that's my presentation of Quigley's historical context for where we are now. Sorry it took, I don't know how long it took, but sorry it took as long as it did. And I'll open this up to questions now, if we can do that. Well, are we frozen?
Yeah. I have a question, Dave.
Yeah, Clark.
So are there, looking at your historical conditions, are there parallels where the U.S. can again expand rather than just simply decay?
Yes, yeah. The two parallels that I talked about were that there's actually been 3 ages of conflict in Western civilization. The first occurred at the end of the Middle Ages and before the Renaissance. And Western civilization was able to reform itself
Right.
at that time and entered into a new age of expansion that included the Renaissance. Then there was another age of conflict from about 1650 to 1815, the period of the American Revolution, the English Revolution, and the French Revolution. And in those periods, Western civilization was again able to reform itself. The defeat of Napoleon ended the threat of a universal empire in 1815, and we entered on a new age of expansion that went from 1815 until basically an economic expansion until 1930, 1929. But we entered into an age of conflict at some point beginning in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we avoided a universal empire that would have been established in Western civilization by Nazi Germany. And then we entered into another age of expansion under the auspices of the United States. And it's that age of expansion that is beginning to enter in the last decade or two into an age of conflict, because, at least in my application of Quigley's methodology, our instruments at every level are working less well than they used to. And the two things, and I think we have it. I mean, to fast forward to the last class, if you were to ask me what are the attributes of Western civilization that allowed it to uniquely reform itself, because under Quigley's methodology, I don't think there's any other civilization that's ever come out of an age of conflict and not gone into a universal empire and ultimately decay. Western civilization has uniquely avoided that 3 times.
It's 8 o'clock.
And I think the reason why we've been able to avoid that is because of the traditions of our culture and civilization that are being challenged now. I mean, the belief in a scientific method, the belief in rationality as a means to cope with problems, a belief I mean, when you think about it for a minute, think about Christianity. I'm not sure, I don't know enough about every other religion, but I don't know how many religions are built on a person, on a man, God, who was crucified in his own time. And a civilization that's built on the idea that that crucified man who was humiliated, tortured, and murdered by his own community, that man was God, and the resurrection of all of us, is a civilization that does not believe that the powers that be necessarily are right or correct. It's a civilization that believes that change is an important aspect of our culture and of our worldview. So that Christian belief, the democratic, our belief in democracy, to me, the two most important drivers of the Western civilization's ability to reform itself, particularly in the last 2 ages of conflict, are free markets. And by that, I don't mean entirely free markets. Markets operate within a social and economic and legal structure. There's no market that's purely free. The question is, what kind of structure do we want the market to operate in. But markets, when they're healthy, can be a tremendous impetus for reform. The other is democracy. A democracy, when it's healthy, can be a tremendous impetus for reform. Those things have saved us in the past, and they will save us again if we can adhere to them. The challenge for us is we've got a democracy that's dysfunctional in certain ways, not necessarily by corruption, but just by the rural-urban thing that I was talking about before. Our democracy doesn't work as well as it may need to in order to foster the change that we need. Our markets are increasingly monopolized. Most markets are now increasingly dominated by a few major actors, or maybe even one major actor in some cases. We've not enforced our antitrust laws probably in 30 years. And the merger and acquisition boom that that many of us prospered from has consolidated most industries to the point where there's almost no more industries that we can consolidate. But and that is a threat, because monopoly power or oligarchic power can prevent reforms from occurring. So I think we've done it before by adhering to the values that have been an important part of Western civilization for ever since the crucifixion. We can do it again, but those values are being challenged right now, mostly by people that don't appreciate that they're challenging those values and actually may believe they're trying to advance them. Sorry for going on so long, Clark.
Dave,
Yeah.
you're talking about Western civilization and its ability to regenerate itself, but we are a globalized civilization nowadays with so many different cultural influences. How does that fit into this model?
Well, I take two things. One is that I think within our own nation, and actually probably within Western civilization, but certainly within our own nation, I think immigrants from whatever backgrounds typically are more Catholic than the Pope, if you will. I think they tend to have a stronger appreciation for the values of Western civilization, in part because they may come from places that didn't live to aspire to those values or live to them. But I think that the immigrants in our country, as immigrants in our country have always done for the last 200 years, assimilate those values and in some sense appreciate those values more than people who have been here longer. The other thing I would say is that the globalization is a political problem, because our problems are increasingly global and we do not have the international instruments to effectively address them. And we've also got a major challenge as to whether and I don't mean to sound like a biased in favor of Western civilization, but I will confess that I am biased in favor of Western civilization. I think we for all the terrible things that have been done in the name of Western civilization, and God knows there are plenty of them, it still is the most successful form of it's the most successful civilization that's ever existed. And I think it's the most successful because we aspire to values that, even though we often don't live up to them, we at least try. And so I don't know. I think there's a real question as to whether the international structure that is created, that needs to be created to deal with these problems, is going to be a structure consistent with Western values, or is it going to be a structure consistent with different values? and I think that's, not to sound jingoistic, but I think that's a real concern. I fear that, yeah, I'll stop there.
Dave, I have a question about how to end the age of a conflict. Do we have to re-enter an age of expansion? And if you're re-entering an age of expansion, an expansion of what? Economics, geography, human rights? What kind of expansions allow you to outgrow this age of conflict?
Well, I think that is an excellent question, and I wish I wish I had the answer to it, because I do think that one of our problems is that the economic vehicle that we have utilized involves the employment in people in jobs. And when I was in undergraduate school, I had a labor economics course. And I remember our professor asked us, and this was back in 1968, he said, how well would our economy operate if robots could provide every good that we need and provide every service that we want? How would our economy operate under those circumstances? I think part of what we're confronting right now is, how do we answer that question? How do we find a way to give people purpose and meaning to their lives? And people don't get purpose and meaning from their lives by getting government handouts. People get purpose and meaning from their lives in a number of ways, but one way in particular is by doing something in a society that they feel has meaning, where they're making a real contribution. Maybe it's only their family, maybe it's just their community, maybe it's their job, but some way or another, they get that sense. And I think we've got a real challenge, is to figure out how to structure our society around this new technology to give people that ability. But I think our economic, I'll give you a short answer, and I think it's an excellent question, is I don't think economic expansion necessarily needs to be a physical economy expansion. It can be an expansion of goods and services. I mean, we could expand our economy tremendously right now by inventing solutions to our energy problem in the context of climate change. And we are doing it. Whether we're doing it fast enough is a difficult question to answer. Or maybe it's easy to say we're not doing it fast enough. Whether we can do it fast enough is a difficult question to answer. But we could certainly invest a tremendous amount in that area and create employment in that area.
Perhaps because an expansion even there is consumptive of resources in a world that is scarce of resources. Sometimes some people are saying they can't even get the right kind of sand anymore to make concrete. The world is running out of good sand. So our success may rely upon the failure of other nation states by taking away their resources that they need to grow. And that's why I'm concerned about an economic expansion in terms of the physical aspects of it. Fine if we all expand by watching more movies that are more expensive or whatever, that's fine. But to create many more things is resource consumptive, and that concerns me.
Well, and I agree with you, and I think that is one of the ways in which the instrument that we previously used for economic expansion is becoming less functional, because that physical expansion may no longer be environmentally sound. And it would be ironic if we destroyed our physical. I mean, the whole purpose of an economy is to give us physical security and well-being. And it would be ironic if we destroyed our environmental physical security and well-being in an effort to keep the economy going. But I don't have the answers to these things. I don't even know if I have the right questions to ask in the terms of why are things not working as well as as we want them to.
Well, thank you, Dave, for getting us started on this. We have 3 more weeks to further explore some of the factors that involved and the challenges that face us. But this is a great grounding, and we certainly are glad that all of you were here to join us tonight. We are recording these sessions. If you happen to have to miss one, you should be able to catch up with it on our YouTube channel. But thank you for being here, and we'll see you next Thursday at
Thanks
7.
very much.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. I'm
Peace.
sorry I talked too much.
No, it's the purpose, Dave. It's the purpose.
All right,
Thank
thanks.
you. All right. Good night, all.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.